Hi, I'm Rachel, a resource expert and career coach for museum educators who are stretched thin but long to fall in love with their world-changing work. After over 15 years with my own hands in the glitter, I know how it feels when your board thinks your work is childish because you work with children. I know how hard it is to lead a tour on a difficult subject, and I know the frustration of waiting on a school bus that is 20 minutes late. Or worse, 10 minutes early. As I'm heading towards the second half of my career, I find myself with a passion to help my fellow educators reverse the chronic state of being overworked and underappreciated so that they can reclaim their creativity and emotional energy. Join me and my museum buddies as we share our best tips, tricks, and techniques for modern museum education. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 12 Days of Christmas Museum Education Edition, my holiday gift to the museum educator community. So as you know, for about 12 days in the month of December, I'm releasing a daily short podcast that is filled with actionable tips, grounded in current research, to help you level up your museum education programs. So today's episode is about how we can bring in more creativity and originality into the work that we're doing. And this episode is inspired by a book that I read over the summer for one of my classes on leadership and innovation. And the book is Originals by Adam Grant. And you may have heard of him. He has a really well-received podcast. He's written several books. If you've not read his work or looked into his work, you should check that out. This particular book, Originals, I really enjoyed. It's an easy read. It's relatively quick. It's very accessible, easy to get through, but it has so many rich ideas. And I really think that his concept of originality and innovation blends very well with the work that we do in museum education, because museum education is, by its very nature, innovative. So back in the progressive era, 100 years ago, it was innovative thinkers that pushed the boundaries of what museums had been about up to that point to suggest that perhaps the most important work that we do inside of museums happens not in our own minds, but that it happens in the mind and the experience of the visitor. And that was wildly innovative 100 years ago. And ever since that point, museum educators have continued to push against the status quo of what museums have always been about. And museum education, I think about museum education as being very forward-thinking and very innovative. So when I see museum education programs that are just sort of resting on their laurels and doing the same thing that they've always done, even if it's working really well, I get a little sad because I know we can always push to be a little bit better. We can be more inclusive. Our program design can be more human-centered. We can create space for more richer kinds of experiences. And so this book inspired me to think about what kind of mindset and practices we need to be building into our museum education work in order to foster this kind of innovation. In his book, Adam Grant challenges the idea that innovation is just about having brilliant ideas. And he suggests that innovation is actually fostered by environments where original ideas can thrive. So I was thinking about how can we foster this kind of environment where original ideas can thrive inside of our museums and our education programs. For Adam Grant, fostering originality primarily means challenging the status quo. And for me, I think that just fits so perfectly inside the work that we do as museum educators. We should be challenging the status quo. And I'm talking like big status quos, like we need to be challenging the colonial nature of our museums, and we need to be challenging how accessible or inaccessible they are physically and financially and all of the things. But also, we can challenge the status quo on a much smaller scale. So if you want to get big and bold and have some grand ideas next year, go for that. But if all that you have the capability for, if all that you have the resources for is to challenge status quo on a small scale, then you should also do that. That is also perfectly, wonderfully fine and a great example of the constant iteration and improvement that we should be pushing for in our museum education programs. So on a small scale, how can you challenge the status quo in your museum education programs next year? Maybe you look at your regular tour flow. Can you flip it? Can you reverse it? Can you highlight different objects? Can you shake up your narrative a little bit? If you can't actually reverse the physical flow of your tour, the direction that people are moving through your museum, then maybe can you reverse the order in which you talk about specific objects? So think like if there are places where traditionally there has been no physical movement or interaction, can you try to bring in physical movement or physical interaction for your visitors in those spaces? Conversely, if there have been parts of your tour that are generally very heavy on the physical movement, can you challenge that status quo and maybe make it a reflective space? Can you invite in more quiet? Can you invite in more thoughtfulness? So there's a lot of ways that we can challenge the status quo. So I would encourage you to foster innovation by shaking up what you already do. The second way that you can foster innovation is to create an environment where you encourage blue sky thinking. Blue sky thinking is one of my favorite techniques for not only for doing museum education, but also for leadership. And I literally have no idea where I first heard the term blue sky thinking. I think it was on a podcast somewhere years ago, but blue sky thinking is this concept that encourages us to imagine what could be possible if there were no restrictions. If you could just come up with ideas that would fill from where you're standing all the way to the clear blue sky with no restrictions at all, no worries about budget or time constraints or established norms that have to be followed. If you could just imagine with no restrictions, that's blue sky thinking. So in the museum setting, blue sky thinking is the perfect opportunity to imagine radical changes in how we engage our audiences, radical changes in how we craft our narratives, radical changes in how we approach programming. Now, not all of the radical changes that you imagine are going to be feasible because we do live in the real world and we do have restrictions. But if you start imagining from a restricted place, then your ultimate plans are going to be even smaller than your first ideas. So if you can make your first ideas as big and bold and radical as you possibly can, somewhere in all of those ideas is going to be a really fantastic action point that is both radical and feasible. And that's what you're looking for. And in the book Originals, Adam Grant makes a very strong case for the importance of having just an onslaught of ideas. He suggests that brilliant ideas actually only happen amongst a million regular or even terrible ideas. So the more ideas and the bigger, bolder, grander imaginings that you can come up with, the more likely you are to actually stumble upon a truly brilliant and also feasible idea. So encourage and allow space for blue sky thinking, both for yourself and for your staff. The third point along these same lines is to embrace an abundance mindset. And this kind of goes along with blue sky thinking. When you start out thinking in ways that are restricted by limitations and you're focused on all of the lack of resources, the lack of time, the lack of staff, the lack of money, the lack of space. In museum education, we operate in a real world setting that is filled with lack. And that's true. And I completely recognize that. And I lived and worked in a space like that for years. But when you let yourself sit in that mindset, you lose it's like your imagination muscle atrophies, and you lose the ability to think radically about how things actually could change. So all of these, if you're noticing all these ideas tied together, when you have an abundance mindset, you're able to engage in blue sky thinking, which allows you to challenge the status quo. Does that make sense? So let me give you some practical applications for what this might actually look like inside of your education programs. So first of all, I would encourage you to challenge assumptions. Allow yourself and encourage your staff to ask what if questions, to reevaluate your traditional methods of engagement. So for example, what if we created a museum exhibit that didn't rely on objects? What if we created a program that relied on storytelling and imagination instead? Secondly, foster a safe space for creativity. You really need to establish a culture where you and your whole team feel very comfortable proposing unconventional ideas without fear of failure or judgment. And this is so key. And it's so important that it's something that there's an entire chapter in Adam Grant's book about fostering a culture where failure is not only acceptable, but kind of expected. The more ideas you have, some of which will fail, the more likely you are to find a brilliant idea that will succeed. And it's a numbers game, essentially. So when you're afraid of failure, you're afraid to try. So for example, you might consider hosting an innovation day where employees and this is really radical, maybe you invite employees from all departments in your museum to come together and collectively brainstorm educational programs. But make sure that in that space, everyone feels very comfortable saying something that might actually not be a great idea. And this is where you need to make sure that you have a work environment that is psychologically safe. And we could talk at length about creating psychologically safe museums, not just for our visitors, but also for our staff. I think that's really important. I don't think it's something we talk enough about. You can't encourage a culture that allows for failure if you don't have a culture that is psychologically safe. So make sure that you are thinking along those lines as you are trying out some of these ideas. You might also consider collaborating with external innovators. So tap into potential outside partnerships. Maybe it's local tech companies or artists or community groups or your local library, or even, maybe partnering with businesses in your area. Again, you're never going to know what great ideas are just waiting to be discovered if you don't dig a little and you don't try some things out. So, get courageous and break the mold, bring in some fresh perspectives. Lastly, as you're going through this process, iteration and experimentation are very important. And I talked a little bit about iteration in the episode on systems thinking, but that is a really important part of this process. Once you have an idea, it can't just be static. Ideas are organic and they have to live and breathe. So give them some space, let them grow, offer them the chance to succeed. They might fail. If they fail, go back to the drawing board, try again. Don't let one failure derail your entire innovation process, because the whole point here is that original ideas, number one, don't exist in isolation. And number two, original, really, really, really amazing ideas might be rare, but ideas themselves cannot be rare. You have to have lots of ideas in order to find a really fantastic one, sort of hidden amongst all of the regular ones. Does that make sense? That, for me, was a flashpoint of inspiration. When I was reading this book and thinking about the concept of innovation, I tend to be someone who likes to have a good idea before I share it, or to feel very confident that my idea is good before I share it. And this book really challenged my thinking on that, to encourage me to say, not all ideas are good, but all good ideas are ideas. They start from just being an idea. So the more ideas that you allow space for, the more likely a really great one is going to rise to the surface. So in conclusion, I just want to encourage you to think about how you can foster a culture of innovation inside of your museum space over the next year. How can you, not just for visitors, not just for exhibits, but how can you, amongst your own staff and in your program planning, encourage a culture of innovation and originality? All right, that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening in. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute, leave a review, or share it with a colleague who might find it helpful. And I'll be back again tomorrow for day 8 of the 12 Days of Christmas. And in the meantime, keep thinking big and just remember that there are never limits to the creativity that we can pull into museum education. Thank you so much for joining us. If this episode has been helpful to you or interesting, please take a minute to like, subscribe, and leave a review, which will help other museum educators find this resource. As always, if you would like to work with me more directly, have any questions, or would like to be a guest on the podcast, you can find links to all that and more on my website, modernmuseumeducation.com. I'll see you back here next time, and in the meantime, please remember that your work is not childish just because you work with children.